And for more on the economic impact of HIV/AIDS, we're joined now by Mead Over. He's a senior fellow at the Center for Global Development. Mead, good to have you on the show. Thanks for joining us.
Nice to be here, Michelle.
Mead, how much does AIDS and HIV cost the global economy annually?
So the way to look at that question, Michelle, is to look at how much the middle income and the lower income countries where AIDS is most prevalent have to spend. And that number is about $19.6 billion last year.
Now that seems like a pretty small number, Mead, if you put it in the context of other numbers. For example, Apple's market cap being $700 million. It seems a drop in the ocean to spend $20 billion on the prevention and treatment of AIDS.
I think you meant that Apple's market cap is $700 billion.
Yes, $700 billion.
Yes, that's true. It does seem small compared to the rich country economy. But we have to remember that of the 35 million people who are currently infected with HIV, as mentioned in your previous section there, the vast majority of those live in extremely poor countries where the per capita income is below $1,000. And in those countries, the individual cannot afford to buy expensive drugs like Truvada at the prices that we pay in the United States. Luckily, the drugs are much less expensive there, but still, typically the individual with AIDS will have to have spending greater than the amount that he earns in order to stay alive.
Well, what about the impact that AIDS has on the labor force, both in sub-Saharan Africa and in the developed world?
So to the extent that people are taking these very effective treatments, such as was described in your previous segment, the effect on the labor force can be almost non-existent. The problem is that in the developing world, the access to treatment, first of all, the access to testing that people need in order to find out that they need treatment, and then the access to treatment, of course, is nowhere near as good as it might be in the United States or in Western Europe. So in those countries, some people, unfortunately, don't learn that they're HIV infected, and therefore, after 8 years of infection, they do become sick. Now, at that point, treatment still works, but it's less effective. If those people are lucky to have good treatment and they adhere to their medication, again, the impact on the labor force will be small. The other thing to keep in mind is that most of the infected people in the poor countries are not among the highest wage earners in those countries. And therefore, the impact on productivity can be relatively small, and especially in comparison to the entire economies in which these people live.
Mead, in terms of money being spent, is the highest cost going towards things like antiretrovirals?
So the United States government gives a great deal of money to support the battle against HIV/AIDS in developing countries. It gives more than any other country, and it gives about $5 to $6 billion a year. Out of the total $30 billion the U.S. government spends on HIV/AIDS every year, about 20% of that, about $6 billion, goes to developing countries. Of that, I'd say about a quarter goes for drugs. The other quarter goes for the actual providers who provide the care, and then the other half is for HIV prevention.
Well, antiretroviral drugs have come down significantly in prices. A lot of competition amongst various generic pharmaceutical manufacturers have brought the cost of AIDS treatment down by 99% over the past decade. Mead, what impact does this have on the big pharmaceutical giants like Gilead and GlaxoSmith?
Well, I believe that many of these pharmaceutical companies have tried to work hard with the developing countries and with the international agencies like UNAIDS in order to make their drugs more accessible. Usually, I believe, but it's hard to know if you're not an insider at those companies, I believe they're still selling those drugs at above the marginal cost of producing them. So I believe that their profits are increased by the sales in developing countries, although they don't earn anywhere near as much money per year per patient as they would in the United States.
Well, UNAIDS is focusing more on the need to reduce new infections than on treatment expansions. What are the details and the significance of this shift very quickly?
So because of the efficacy of AIDS treatment that was described in your previous segment with that young man Adonis, there's been a real emphasis since 2003 to try to place more and more people on treatment in poor countries where they can't afford it on their own and where even the medicine had not been available. And that has been quite effective. The number of people on treatment has risen so that now in the world at large, that number is above 14 million. 14 out of the 35 million who have treatment. But the problem is that the burden of this treatment cost on the poor countries and on the donors like the United States is also growing. The top line in that graph that you're showing shows the total number of people living with HIV. It's continuing to grow. The number of people on treatment continuing to grow, and that fiscal burden is more than the poor countries can support on their own. So the important thing is to focus on the new infections, to bring that down below the mortality rate. When it's below the mortality rate, the total number of people living with HIV/AIDS will begin to fall, the fiscal burden will begin to fall, and the dependency burden, the degree to which these countries are dependent on foreign donors for the very livelihoods of their infected citizens will also begin to fall. It's very good news that the UNAIDS, the United Nations agency, has begun to focus on bringing those new infections down.
Okay. Still a long way to go. We're going to have to leave it there. Thank you so much, Mead Over, Senior Fellow at the Center for Global Development.